I arrived home that afternoon and found my daughter sitting on the porch steps, hunched over her prosthetic leg with trembling hands. The color-drained expression on her face was enough to make my heart skip. At first, I couldn't see exactly what had happened. Then I noticed the neon yellow marker slashes across the pink butterflies and swirling vines she'd so carefully painted months before. It looked like someone had tried to write "comply" or "leave" in all capital letters, as if issuing a grim ultimatum. My daughter, Olivia, glanced up with tears sliding down her cheeks. She swallowed hard, struggling to speak. I knelt beside her and gently touched the ruined design, feeling my anger rise in my chest like a wave. There was no doubt in my mind who was responsible, or at least who had orchestrated this cruelty. I asked Olivia if she was hurt, and she shook her head. Her voice came out hoarse. She said she'd discovered the vandalism when she got off the school bus. I inhaled sharply, staring at the fluorescent lines scrawled across her beloved prosthetic. Months earlier, we'd spent hours with a local artist, designing those butterflies that twirled around cartoon stars. Seeing them tainted by hateful scribbles made me feel like I'd swallowed a bag of nails. It took everything in me to stay calm and pull Olivia into a protective hug. She tried to be strong, but her words emerged in choked whispers. Why would anyone do this to me? That question echoed in my mind while I helped her into the house. I couldn't provide a comforting answer. I could only guess that it was linked to the Willow Glen HOA's infamous aesthetic rules. People warned me about the Homeowners Association when I bought this property 6 months ago. Their strict was the mildest description. Their tyrants was more accurate, especially with Karen at the helm. She was the longtime HOA president, rumored to be a master of intimidation. I'd witnessed her scolding another neighbor for having holiday lights an inch too high, but I never thought the obsession with appearances would extend so far as to target a child's medical device. Shutting the front door behind us, I vowed to uncover the truth and bring whoever did this to justice. Inside, Olivia sat at the kitchen table, studying the smudged words etched into her prosthetic. She kept rubbing the marks, trying to see if they'd wipe away easily. They didn't. I told her not to worry, that we'd figure out how to repaint or replace it. She nodded, her eyes filled with that quiet heartbreak I'd seen after her surgery. 2 years ago, a drunk driver had veered into our lane, resulting in a catastrophic accident that claimed Olivia's lower left leg. In the hospital, she'd asked if she'd ever dance again, or run, or even stand without pain. Through intense therapy and unstoppable courage, she'd learned how to walk on a prosthetic. It became part of her identity, a symbol of her resilience. Now, this act of vandalism felt like an attack on the very essence of her spirit. I clenched my jaw, then grabbed my phone and stepped onto the back porch to make a call. My first impulse was to contact the HOA directly, but I knew they'd deny everything or twist the story. Instead, I dialed my friend Paul, who lived a few blocks away. Paul was no fan of Karen either, having been fined last year for planting flowers that apparently clashed with the approved color palette of the community. He picked up on the second ring, sounding concerned the moment he heard my tone. I explained what had happened, and he let out a bitter laugh. "Sounds exactly like something Karen would do," he said, "though she usually harasses people with letters or fines. This is a new level of cruelty." He mentioned that the next HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday. "If I were you," Paul said, "I'd show up and confront them directly. If Karen's behind it, she'll try to play innocent, but at least you can put it on the record." That sounded like a start, so I thanked him. I also texted a couple of other neighbors to see if they'd seen anything suspicious. One responded with a cryptic message, "I have a camera on my porch. Not sure if it captured your driveway." My pulse quickened. If there was footage, that might be enough to bring the vandal to account. I told them I was willing to check any video they had, and they said they'd let me know if it showed anything relevant. My mind whirled with possibilities. The last thing I wanted was a drawn-out feud, but I had no choice. They'd crossed the line. When I returned to the kitchen, Olivia was on her phone, searching for ways to remove permanent marker. She looked up, tears still lingering in her eyes, and asked if we could salvage the design. I told her we'd do our best. Then, trying to steady myself, I sat down with her. We made small talk about her day at school, her teachers, the upcoming class project. As we spoke, I watched the light in her eyes flicker with uncertainty. No child should worry about being targeted in her own neighborhood, and no parent should stand idly by while it happens. That night, I found it impossible to sleep. My mind replayed the old warnings people had given me when I decided to move here. They said Willow Glen was a pristine place for families. Property values were high, the lawns were manicured, the houses all looked like they came out of a magazine. But they also mentioned that the HOA was run more like a private regime than a community board. Karen Golding, in particular, had a knack for bending the rules to her advantage. She was rumored to have connections with local officials, even the mayor, which allowed her to get away with more than a typical HOA president could dream of. I'd heard stories about neighbors receiving cease and desist letters for minor infractions, about monthly dues being raised for vague beautification projects, about a push to develop certain areas near protected wetlands. It seemed Karen was not just a neighborhood busybody, she was a power broker who got what she wanted, or else. In the morning, I decided to document everything. I took photos of the vandalized prosthetic from multiple angles, noting the bright marker color, the partial letters that spelled out "comply." Then I drove Olivia to school, assuring her we'd handle the matter. She managed a brave smile, stepping out of the car carefully. As I watched her walk inside, my heart twisted. I wanted more than anything to shield her from the ugliness that lurked in the world, but here it was, practically on our doorstep. On my way back home, I stopped by the neighbor's house, who mentioned security cameras, but no one answered. Undeterred, I left a note explaining that I was very interested in reviewing the footage. By the time I returned, there was a small white envelope stuck in my mailbox. My name was written on the outside in narrow handwriting. I opened it to find a single sheet of HOA stationery with an official seal at the top. It read, "Notice of non-compliance. Your household is in violation of Willow Glen Community Policy 17A regarding external modifications to medical or assistive devices that may be visibly disruptive to neighborhood harmony. Please schedule a meeting with the board to discuss corrective action or face possible fines." I stared at the paper, my hands shaking. They were calling my daughter's prosthetic leg a disruptive external modification. The arrogance in that phrase made my stomach churn. This confirmed my suspicion. Karen wasn't just turning a blind eye. She was actively framing the customized art on Olivia's prosthetic as a violation, presumably to justify the vandalism. I half laughed at the audacity, though it was laughter edged with outrage. So, she was going to come after us not just with intimidation but with official HOA threats. I wasted no time. I called the phone number listed on the notice and went to a voicemail where Karen's crisp voice informed me that if I was calling about a compliance issue, I should leave my name and address. Instead of leaving a message, I hung up. I wanted a direct conversation, not a curated voicemail box. She must have anticipated that I'd be furious. Maybe she was waiting for the next HOA meeting to ambush me in public. Fine, I thought, let her try. For the next few days, I kept a low profile, avoiding public confrontations but collecting every piece of evidence I could. I also noticed a couple more suspicious details around our community. One evening, while walking the dog, I spotted Karen's silver SUV parked near the entrance to the wetlands, the engine running. She appeared to be on the phone, scanning the area as if checking for prying eyes. The wetlands themselves were a point of contention. Rumors said Karen was quietly supporting a development project that would fill part of it to build luxury townhouses, ignoring environmental protections. I had never been heavily involved in local environmental issues, but something about it felt off. If Karen was willing to sabotage a child's prosthetic leg, who knew what she'd do to get rid of marshland that stood in her way? My neighbor Paul accompanied me on that walk, and I pointed out Karen's SUV. He frowned, telling me about a hush-hush plan called Willow Creek Renewal, which supposedly aimed to beautify the area by adding a golf course. In reality, that would mean draining the wetlands. She's got connections, Paul said quietly, and rumor is that certain city council members stand to profit. Karen's the perfect local enforcer. Everyone who tries to protest ends up buried in HOA penalty. I felt a wave of unease. This was no ordinary meddling. It sounded like a microcosm of political corruption, right in our idyllic suburb. Thursday arrived with a certain tension. The HOA meetings were always held in a small community center near the entrance of Willow Glen. I showed up early, a handful of neighbors milled about, sipping coffee or flipping through the agenda. Karen was seated at the front of the room, behind a table with a placard that read President, flanked by 3 board members who looked more like subordinates than equals. She wore a pastel mood blouse and had her hair pulled back in a neat bun. The moment I entered, her gaze locked onto me. She offered a tight, practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. Paradise Design shot some general suave accuracy. I found a seat in the second row near a couple of other homeowners. One of them whispered a quiet greeting, but most people seemed uneasy about any direct acknowledgement. I suspected Karen had them under her thumb, or that they feared retaliation. The meeting began with a perfunctory reading of last month's minutes, something about repainting the clubhouse and adjusting fence height regulations. Then Karen turned her attention to new business, scanning the room as if searching for potential troublemakers. When she finally acknowledged me, it was with an air of condescension. It appears we have a matter involving Mr. Harrison, who is in violation of Community Policy 17A. Please step forward so we can discuss resolution. My name is Alexander Harrison, though I go by Alex. And hearing Karen say it in that clipped tone felt like nails on a chalkboard. I stood, took a breath, and said calmly, "Actually, I'd like to address the vandalism committed against my daughter's prosthetic leg. I believe that's far more urgent than your so-called violation." A hush fell over the room. Karen pursed her lips. "We can address that separately, but for now, we're dealing with your refusal to comply with our guidelines." I suppressed a wave of anger, placing a small stack of printed photos on the table in front of me. They showed the damage to Olivia's prosthetic. "This is my child's medical device," I said, my voice trembling despite my effort to appear composed. "Someone scrawled hateful messages across it, and I have reason to believe the HOA was involved, considering I received an official notice calling her leg a disruptive external modification. How do you justify that?" One of the board members, a woman named Rita, looked away, clearly uncomfortable. Karen, however, only arched an eyebrow. "We do not condone vandalism," she said, in a tone that suggested she was reading from a script, "but we do have standards. Perhaps someone took it upon themselves to enforce those standards in an unfortunate manner. However, that doesn't absolve you from your obligation to maintain neutral appearances in the neighborhood. We can't have every homeowner painting flamboyant designs on items visible to the public." My hands curled into fists at my sides. "Flamboyant? You're talking about a child's prosthetic. Are you even hearing yourself?" Karen gave me an icy stare. "I am simply explaining that, while it is regrettable your daughter's device was defaced, it wouldn't have become an issue if you had followed the guidelines to begin with." A murmur spread among the assembled neighbors, some shifting uncomfortably. Someone near the back called out, "This is wrong. You can't blame a kid for wanting a colorful prosthetic." But Karen's gaze swept over the room, and that person went silent. I realized then that fear was the primary currency she traded in. She thrived on intimidation and misdirection, turning the conversation from a crime into a technical debate about policy. Before I could respond, she added, "Regarding the vandalism, the HOA is willing to investigate. We'll form a subcommittee to look into any suspicious activity, but until that process is complete, you need to rectify your violation. That is our official stance." Her final words rang with finality, as if the matter were settled. I glanced at the other board members, searching for a hint of dissent. Rita stared at her folded hands, while the others wore expressions of carefully arranged neutrality. Fury boiled in my chest, but I managed to keep my tone measured. I will not repaint my daughter's prosthetic in some bland color just because you claim it offends your aesthetic. This is a blatant disregard for her rights under disability law. Karen leaned forward, placing her manicured fingertips on the table. We have legal counsel who confirms that our community guidelines, including medical device aesthetics, are enforceable through fines. You may want to consider compliance before those fines pile up. That was it. I was done. I picked up my photos and turned away, ignoring the flash of triumph in her eyes. My hands were shaking, yet I knew I had to keep my composure. She was expecting an outburst. I wouldn't give her the satisfaction. Leaving the meeting felt like escaping a suffocating atmosphere. Paul caught up with me outside. He looked distressed. "Did you hear the part about forming a subcommittee to investigate the vandalism?" he asked. "That's code for burying the problem until everyone forgets." I exhaled hard, my stomach in knots. "We'll see about that," I said, my mind already turning to legal options. My next step was to call a lawyer, maybe contact a local disability rights organization. They had to have some guidance for people dealing with HOAs that overstepped their bounds. Driving home, I thought about the bigger picture. If Karen was so brazen in flouting basic decency toward a child, how far did her reach extend? She'd mentioned legal counsel, but who were they? Did she have law enforcement in her pocket as well? And what about those wetlands that I suspected were tied to a development project? Everything felt interconnected, a spider's web with Karen at the center. My priority was protecting Olivia, but a part of me realized we might be tangling with deeper corruption than a typical HOA squabble. After I got home, I checked on Olivia, who was doing her homework quietly in her room. She gave me a small smile, trying to be supportive, but I could see the sadness in her eyes. She sensed the tension. I made a few calls. First, I contacted an old colleague, Jennifer, who had some background in civil litigation. She suggested I look up an attorney with specific experience in disputes involving the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA. She also told me that if the HOA was enforcing a rule that discriminated against a disabled individual, they could be violating federal law. I was relieved to hear that we might have legal standing, but I also felt the weight of how difficult a fight like this could be. Second, I contacted the police station to file an official vandalism report. The officer who took my statement sounded sympathetic, but he also explained that proving who did it might be tricky unless I had conclusive video evidence or an eyewitness. I mentioned Karen's name as a suspect in orchestrating it, given the letter referencing the prosthetic as a violation. The officer said they'd include it in their notes, but I shouldn't expect a speedy resolution. Later that evening, while rummaging through our old paperwork, I found the Willow Glen HOA guidelines that had been mailed to me after closing on the house. Buried among pages of landscaping instructions and fence height regulations was a vague clause about approved aesthetic standards for external fixtures or devices. It didn't explicitly mention prosthetics or any other medical equipment, though. I snapped pictures of that page and forwarded them to Jennifer. She quickly responded that based on her reading, the HOA was on shaky ground. But shaky ground might not stop them from intimidating me or forcibly collecting fines. The next morning, as I headed out to the driveway, I noticed a small piece of paper taped to the windshield of my car. It was another HOA violation notice claiming my mailbox was 3 inches too tall and threatening a $50 fine if it wasn't rectified within a week. I almost laughed at the absurdity. This was a classic tactic: inundate a homeowner with petty violations so they become overwhelmed or give in. Instead of giving in, I felt more determined to push back. Later that day, I reached out to a local disability advocacy group. The person I spoke with, Camille, listened to my story with dismay. She told me that if the HOA was targeting a minor's prosthetic, it could be considered both harassment and discrimination. She took down my information and said they'd see if they could provide pro bono legal support or at least direct me to attorneys experienced in ADA litigation. Over the next week, the tension escalated. Another neighbor approached me with hushed urgency, showing me a letter she'd received that threatened increased HOA dues if she didn't vote in favor of the next land development initiative. That neighbor guessed it had to do with the wetlands. She was terrified of speaking out, since Karen had a reputation for making life miserable for dissidents. Meanwhile, Paul told me about a rumor that Karen was hosting private meetings with certain board members to expedite new regulations that would pave the way for a large-scale construction project. All of this made me suspect that the impetus behind attacking Olivia's prosthetic was some twisted effort to enforce uniformity as part of a broader plan. A plan where the neighborhood looked pristine and unblemished for potential investors. One afternoon, I was startled by a knock at my door. A tall, slender woman with short gray hair introduced herself as Melanie Weber, an attorney from a small firm that specialized in disability rights. Camille had given her my number. I invited her in, grateful for the visit. Melanie was direct. She'd heard the gist of our situation and offered to represent us in filing a complaint against the HOA. We sat at the kitchen table with Olivia upstairs, resting, and went through the entire story. How the prosthetic was defaced, the official notice calling it a disruptive external modification, Karen's mocking attitude at the HOA meeting, and the repeated petty fines that followed. Melanie jotted down notes, occasionally pausing to ask clarifying questions. She was appalled by the HOA's stance. In my professional opinion, this is a clear-cut case of discrimination, she said, tapping her pen on the table. They're treating your daughter's mobility aid like it's a lawn ornament. And if they're collectively harassing you, that's another layer of liability. I felt a small surge of hope. What are our chances of success? I asked. Melanie shrugged slightly. It can be complicated. HOAs have certain powers under state law, but they do not override federal disability protections. The main obstacle is that HOAs sometimes have deep pockets for legal battles, and they can drag this out. But if we can gather enough evidence, especially proof that Karen or her proxies vandalized the prosthetic in an act of intimidation, we could land a significant blow. Have you gotten your hands on any camera footage? I explained that one neighbor had footage, but wasn't sure if it captured the culprit clearly. Melanie advised me to ask again, emphasizing how crucial that evidence could be. The next day, I did exactly that, knocking on my neighbor's door. Her name was Tasha, a relatively new resident who'd installed cameras for her own peace of mind. She looked reluctant to get involved, admitting she didn't want to anger the HOA. I pleaded with her, promising anonymity if it ever came to court. Eventually, she agreed to let me watch her recordings from the day of the vandalism. Sure enough, in one corner of the screen I could make out a figure walking up to our drive. The image was somewhat grainy, but the posture suggested a tall woman wearing a light jacket. The figure bent down at something near the ground, presumably Olivia's prosthetic, before hurrying away. While it wasn't a smoking gun that identified Karen by face, the height and build could match her. Tasha let me copy the file onto a thumb drive, though she looked terrified about potential backlash. I immediately shared this footage with Melanie, who said it was a step in the right direction, but not definitive proof, unless we could tie the jacket or silhouette more clearly to Karen. She proposed we include it anyway when filing a formal complaint with the state agency responsible for investigating discrimination cases. We also decided to file a local police report with the video as evidence of vandalism. Meanwhile, I rummaged for any communications from the HOA that could be interpreted as direct threats. The notices we'd received were couched in bureaucratic language, but the underlying intimidation was obvious to anyone who read them in context. That weekend, a storm rattled through Willow Glen, bringing strong winds and rain. I spent most of Saturday inside, helping Olivia repaint portions of her prosthetic in an effort to cover the hateful scribbles. She chose bright teal and a sparkling silver accent, painting tiny shooting stars where the old butterflies had been defaced. Watching her concentrate on the design made me ache with both pride and sorrow. She was reclaiming something that had been tainted. At one point she paused, brush in hand, and asked, "Dad, do you think they'll ever leave us alone?" I swallowed the lump in my throat. I'm not sure, I admitted, but we'll fight as long as we have to. She gave a small nod, returning to her work with quiet determination. The day after the storm, I walked through the neighborhood, checking for any fallen branches or damage. A few houses down the street, I saw Karen directing a group of men as they dug around a large oak tree near the entrance. She was pointing and barking orders, apparently removing any tree that posed a risk to property. I suspected it was another move related to her rumored development plans. Maybe she was clearing the path. When she caught sight of me, she turned her back pointedly. I debated confronting her, but decided it wouldn't be wise without witnesses. One of the men paused to wipe sweat from his brow. He looked at me apologetically and shrugged, as if to say he was just following orders. My gut churned with the sense that something bigger was brewing. Sure enough, that evening a letter arrived for the entire community announcing a special assessment to fund improvements near the wetlands which were labeled as underutilized land. The letter stated that these improvements would boost property values and create family-friendly attractions. The wording sounded benign, but I knew it likely meant draining or filling part of the wetlands. The assessment was substantial, a few $100s per homeowner, with a threat of penalties for those who didn't pay. This was Karen's playbook: bleed the residents dry, push forward with whatever plans she had cooking, and crush anyone who dissented. I realized then that our personal fight might be a piece of a larger puzzle. If she wanted to appear unstoppable, she couldn't let me or my daughter undermine her authority. A week later, Melanie formally filed our complaint. The Willow Glen HOA received notice from the state, requiring them to respond to allegations of disability discrimination. Karen, through the HOA's official statement, denied any wrongdoing and labeled me a disgruntled homeowner seeking special treatment. The document implied that I was the one exploiting my daughter's condition to avoid following the rules. My blood boiled at the phrasing. Melanie reassured me that this was typical legal posturing designed to shift blame. She also mentioned that if the state agency decided to investigate thoroughly, they might conduct interviews or request documents. Karen and her board might be forced to reveal the extent of their so-called aesthetic guidelines and how they applied them, if they even existed in a legitimate form. Meanwhile, I discovered that Paul and several other residents were secretly gathering information on the wetlands deal. They believed Karen had made promises to a construction company, possibly receiving kickbacks in the process. Some residents had noticed a flurry of unmarked trucks near the wetlands late at night, hauling materials. The more I learned, the more it seemed that overshadowing our dispute about Olivia's prosthetic was a web of corruption. Perhaps Karen worried that if I caused enough noise about one injustice, I might shine a spotlight on her bigger plans. Only afternoon, I received a phone call from an unfamiliar number. The voice on the line was a man who said he used to be an HOA board member, though he'd left in frustration months before. He refused to give his name, but he claimed to have inside information about Karen's relationship with a city council member. "She's got them in her back pocket," he said, in a hushed tone. "That's how she's bypassing some environmental regulations. She's also threatening to fine or evict folks who don't cooperate, framing them as dangerous to the community. Don't let her scare you." The call ended abruptly. Though unverified, it reinforced my suspicion that the vandalism was just one of many shady tactics. While this clandestine drama unfolded, daily life with Olivia continued as best as possible. She went to school, did her chores, tried to keep up her spirits. Occasionally, I'd catch her staring at the newly painted prosthetic with mixed feelings. Sometimes she'd say she missed the old butterfly design, but she also recognized that what she had now was a symbol of resilience. We both knew a war was being waged just outside our door, one that threatened not only her freedom to express herself, but also the integrity of the entire community. On days when I felt overwhelmed, I reminded myself that if we caved, it would send a message that bullies could run rampant. That wasn't a lesson I wanted my daughter to learn. The next HOA meeting loomed closer, promising to address the special assessment for the wetlands improvements. In the lead-up to the gathering, neighbors whispered about a possible showdown. Paul planned to bring up the concerns about corruption. I would confront Karen about the discrimination complaint. Lucy, a retired school teacher on the far side of the neighborhood, had reached out to a local environmental group, hoping they'd attend and highlight the ecological impact. Tensions soared. People who once loved living in Willow Glen started to dread the controlling atmosphere. Some quietly prepared to put their homes up for sale, hoping to leave before the HOA crushed them with more fees or trouble. When the day came, the small community center was packed. I arrived early with Melanie, who carried a folder of documents. Karen sat at the head table with her usual composure, though I detected a slight unease in her posture. A hush fell when she tapped the gavel and welcomed everyone, using that smooth, official tone. She skimmed through minor agenda items, ignoring the restless shifting of neighbors. Then she moved on to the special assessment vote, explaining how beneficial the wetlands project would be. That was Paul's cue. He stood and asked if an environmental impact study had been completed. Karen gave him a withering look. "We have our own internal assessments," she replied, "and this is about economic growth for our lovely community." Paul didn't back down. He pointed out the potential illegality of draining wetlands without state permits. Karen tried to dismiss him, claiming everything was above board. The tension in the room sizzled. Then I seized the moment to address the elephant in the room. "Before you push this vote, how about updating us on the investigation into the vandalism of my daughter's prosthetic leg? I assume you formed a subcommittee as promised?" A few nods and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Karen's eyes narrowed. She brushed off the question, saying the subcommittee's findings were inconclusive. I pressed harder. "So no one saw anything? No suspects? That's quite convenient given how the HOA seems fixated on punishing my daughter instead of the criminal who attacked her property." I felt a swell of support from some neighbors who began to speak up about their own experiences of intimidation or suspect fines. Karen banged the gavel, shouting for order. She tried to maintain control by insisting the conversation return to the wetlands assessment. But the crowd wasn't having it. Lucy raised her voice, demanding accountability for the prosthetic vandalism and the swirling allegations of corruption. Rita, the board member who'd looked uncomfortable before, rose nervously. "As president," she began, "maybe we should address the concerns from Mr. Harrison properly. We can't keep ignoring—" She didn't finish. Karen cut her off with an icy glare, reminding Rita that the board had an agreed-upon agenda, but the momentum had shifted. Neighbors demanded to see the HOA's actual guidelines that singled out medical devices. They wanted to know who wrote these rules and on what authority. The meeting disintegrated into chaos. Karen threatened to adjourn, but the crowd refused to leave. People chanted about wanting transparency, some holding up signs that said, "Save the wetlands" or "Stop discrimination now." Karen's face turned red. She hastily declared the assembly closed, then swept out of the room with her supporters trailing behind. A group of us remained, buzzing with a mix of anger and cautious hope. We recognized we had a chance to take a stand, to force real changes if we banded together. Over the following weeks, Karen tried doubling down. Residents received letters warning them of fines for disruptive behavior at the last meeting. But the tide was turning. The press caught wind of the story. An HOA allegedly defacing a disabled child's prosthetic, coupled with rumors of shady land deals. A local reporter contacted me, asking for an interview. I was initially hesitant, worried about exposing Olivia to more attention, but Melanie encouraged me, explaining that public scrutiny could be our greatest ally against an entrenched system. So I agreed to speak to the media, albeit requesting that they keep Olivia's identity somewhat private. The article that emerged featured a photo of the damaged prosthetic and a direct quote from Melanie about possible ADA violations. Karen responded by issuing a statement through the HOA's website, denying any personal involvement in vandalism, accusing me of seeking publicity, and dismissing the allegations of corruption as baseless rumors. She tried to paint herself as a victim of a smear campaign, orchestrated by a small group of residents who refused to abide by community standards. That same day, I found another note in my mailbox, typed in block letters, "You have no idea who you're messing with, drop this or suffer." The intimidation was blatant, but it only strengthened my resolve. Melanie moved forward with the legal process. She filed a formal lawsuit naming the HOA and Karen individually, alleging harassment, discrimination, and property damage. The suit included the partial video footage, the official notice labeling the prosthetic a violation, and multiple testimonies from neighbors who'd received questionable fines or threats. We even included references to the wetlands fiasco, arguing that Karen's pattern of unethical behavior showed a readiness to ignore rules for personal gain. Though combining all these threads in one suit might complicate matters, Melanie believed it painted a stark picture of how Willow Glen's governance had gone off the rails. As the suit progressed, the state agency investigating the disability complaint reached out for more interviews. They requested a copy of the HOA's bylaws, especially the sections concerning medical devices or anything related to disability accommodations. Karen's camp tried to stall, claiming certain documents were lost. Meanwhile, whispers suggested that city officials were being called to explain how the wetlands permits were being handled. The pressure mounted on Karen from multiple angles, and the once unshakable leader began to show cracks in her armor. Word got around that a few board members were jumping ship, unwilling to go down with her if criminal charges surfaced. Olivia, through all this, remained a quiet pillar of strength. She went about her daily routine, occasionally asking for updates on the lawsuit, but mostly focusing on being a normal teenager. The only time I sensed her fear was late at night, when she'd slip into the living room and confess she worried about losing our home if we lost the fight. I reassured her the best I could, telling her we'd face whatever came together, that we wouldn't let them bully us out of the neighborhood. Part of me was terrified too, but I held on to the conviction that right was on our side. Eventually, the situation reached a crescendo. Karen was subpoenaed for a deposition in our lawsuit. She couldn't dodge it. Under oath, she was asked about her whereabouts on the day Olivia's prosthetic was vandalized. She danced around direct answers, claiming no memory of her activities that afternoon. Then Melanie produced photographic evidence from the neighbor's camera. Though the figure was grainy, it looked enough like Karen to raise serious doubts about her denial. She insisted it wasn't her, but her credibility wavered. Next came questions about the wetlands. She stonewalled, claiming ignorance of any hush-hush development deals, pointing blame at other board members. When asked about the donation records for her re-election campaign, she grew visibly agitated. While this legal drama unfolded, the local news aired a segment on Willow Glen, featuring environmental activists, outraged neighbors, and me speaking about my daughter's situation. Public sentiment appeared to side with us. A wave of scrutiny fell on the HOA, and soon a group of residents launched a petition demanding Karen's resignation and the repeal of the so-called medical device aesthetic rules. The board held an emergency session without Karen present and announced that they would suspend her authority pending further investigation. People in the neighborhood began placing signs on their lawns, "We stand with Olivia." It was a grassroots revolt against a system that had governed by fear for too long. Karen's downfall accelerated when a local journalist uncovered suspicious financial transfers between the HOA treasury and a shell corporation. It appeared that large sums earmarked for beautification projects had disappeared, likely diverted to the wetlands development scheme. Combined with the allegations in our lawsuit, she soon found herself under criminal investigation for fraud and embezzlement. Those who once cowered before her began to speak freely, revealing stories of intimidation and hush money attempts. She went from unassailable tyrant to embattled public figure in a matter of weeks. In the end, the newly reconstituted HOA board voted unanimously to revoke all fines and violation notices related to Olivia's prosthetic, declaring them unconscionable and unenforceable. They issued a public apology to our family, promising to draft new guidelines that respected disability rights and personal expression. Meanwhile, Karen faced mounting legal troubles. Her attempts to shift blame on others didn't save her from multiple charges. Though the criminal case would take time to weave through the courts, she was effectively stripped of her power in Willow Glen. When we finally received a settlement offer in our lawsuit, it included funds for Olivia to replace her prosthetic or repaint it however she wished, compensation for emotional distress, and a promise of structural reforms within the HOA. Melanie called me when the papers arrived. "You have every right to demand more," she said, "but this is a solid offer that addresses your primary concerns. The HOA clearly wants this behind them. You and Olivia can decide if it's sufficient." I looked at my daughter, who was practicing a new design on paper. She'd come so far, both physically and emotionally. The money was less important than the acknowledgement that what they did was wrong. I thought for a moment, then nodded at Melanie. "We'll accept," I said, "as long as they sign a clear statement admitting fault. Olivia needs to see that they can't just sweep this under the rug." A few days later, I stood on our porch, gazing at a sunset that painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. My mind replayed the whirlwind of events, how a single act of vandalism exposed a spiral of corruption, how neighbors who once feared retribution found their voices, and how my daughter discovered she could be stronger than she ever imagined. Karen might have tried to bury us under her rules and intimidation, but we refused to be silent. In fighting back, we not only protected Olivia's right to decorate her prosthetic however she pleased, but also shone a light on a broader injustice that had festered in our community. Now, with the settlement finalized, Olivia was free to wear her leg with pride. No one could ever again cite an arbitrary rule that tried to stifle her creativity. More than that, the wetlands project was on hold. The city council, shamed by the revelations of backdoor deals, pulled their support. Environmental groups were working with a new coalition of residents to protect the land for future generations. Willow Glen itself began to heal. Longtime residents breathed easier, no longer fearing the next letter or penalty. In time, perhaps, the scars would fade. One evening, as Olivia and I walked along the sidewalk near the wetlands, she tested out her newly repainted prosthetic, complete with sunflowers and constellations that glowed in the moonlight. She turned to me and said, "Dad, I still can't believe someone tried to ruin this." Her voice held a note of sadness, but also an undercurrent of triumph. I squeezed her shoulder gently. "They tried. They failed." We kept walking, listening to the frogs croak in the marshy water. A soft breeze rustled the tall grasses. Willow Glen was still our home. And now it felt like a place where we could truly belong. Where people had seen the darkness that lurked under a perfect facade and decided to stand against it. A year later, news came that Karen had been formally indicted on charges of fraud and misappropriation of funds. Some said she might cut a plea deal, naming higher-ups involved in the wetlands fiasco. Her downfall was a cautionary tale, proving that you can't hide injustice forever. Meanwhile, Olivia had joined a local adaptive sports team and regularly participated in track meets, her prosthetic shining in vivid colors that reflected her personality. She no longer shrank from attention. She embraced it. When reporters occasionally asked about her story, she'd say, "I just wanted the right to be me." Sometimes, neighbors who had been silent apologized for not speaking up sooner. I assured them I understood. They were scared. Fear is potent, but so is courage. When I stood up for Olivia, I discovered that many people were just waiting for someone to lead the charge. Once they realized they weren't alone, they refused to let tyranny hold them hostage. In that sense, what started as a personal fight for my daughter's dignity evolved into a collective stand for fairness and transparency. Today, if you drive through Willow Glen, you might still notice the immaculate lawns and uniform mailboxes. But you'll also see a few houses with front gardens bursting in color, or playful murals painted on fences, or ramps and rails designed for accessibility. The HOA board, under new leadership, encourages residents to express themselves while respecting one another's needs. The wetlands remain intact, a protected habitat for herons and frogs, and somewhere along these cozy streets, my daughter walks confidently on a leg that defies dull neutrality, shining with bright, defiant artistry that no one can ever deface again. In the end, that's what mattered most, that a cruel attempt to stifle a child's individuality was overturned by the community's collective will. That Olivia emerged from the ordeal stronger, an emblem of the freedom to be who she is. When I think of the day I found her prosthetic scrawled with hateful ink, I feel a mixture of anger and gratitude. Anger that it happened at all, gratitude that it led us to stand up and fight. Because in doing so, we not only reclaimed her sense of self, we reclaimed our neighborhood from a corrupt system that thrived on fear. And that is how a vandalized prosthetic became the spark that illuminated corruption. That is how Willow Glen found its soul again.